And I wanted to get that head out first before we begin by perhaps looking and defining what exactly the foundation does and what capacity you actually look at.
Well, thank you very much. The Capacity Building Foundation for Africa, ACBF, was created in 1991 because at the time African countries were going through major reforms, policy reforms, and it was discovered that there were very few people available to do the kind of analysis, evaluation, and even the basic design to put in place the kind of policies for economic growth, for a good business environment, and for the type of regulation that is needed to make sure that the public and private sectors work together effectively for development. So the founders of the African Capacity Building Foundation put together this entity to have it focus on three key things: skills, tools, and policies. On the skills side, the primary priority was economic policy and analysis. And the foundation started by supporting think tanks. At the time, there was not a single think tank in Africa. And so the foundation put money in, created think tanks, and now there are 27 of them on the continent in 22 countries. The second issue was basic skills for policy making, evaluation, etc. And through partnerships with universities on the continent, skills were developed with people being trained in public administration, economic policy management, and so on. At present, we have about 1,900 people with a master's or PhD in economic policy who are working in public sector. Makes up about 30% of the public sector in most countries. And you have people who've been trained with short-term courses, skills building for continuous learning in all the areas that are important, like project management, contract negotiation, trade negotiation, etc. And there are about 15,000 of those who have gone through this form of training. The Capacity Building Foundation also focused on tools, particularly for public administration, to make it more effective, transparent, and efficient, and also to make sure that the policies that are needed are in place. So those are the three key areas that the foundation invests in. Yeah,
now I'd imagine you've got your work cut out, because if you're talking about trying to improve governance and those kind of things across the continent, as we know, Africa probably has the biggest need. But just in terms of an assessment of the work you have done so far and what remains to be done, how far would you say you have gone? If I were to be unfair and ask you to perhaps just quantify 10%, 20%, 30%, 50% of the work done, how far have we gone?
Well, I would say in the field of economic policy, we've gone very far, and perhaps it's the best success, and you could see it as a result of the current financial crisis, where African countries have been evaluated by the IMF and others as having done very well in monetary and fiscal policy. South Africa is an example. Many countries are now looking at South Africa. And that kind of capacity was built slowly over time. So you could say the success was macroeconomic policy, monetary, fiscal policy in particular, but also policies for putting in place poverty reduction programs and managing economic growth.
You know, Freddie, maybe a question, maybe just from my side, is if you look at how your endeavours, how they fit in with government objectives and visions, is there a clear link between those two? Or do you maybe have a situation where you're going down a certain path, but certainly you know, you get to a point where there's a changing of guard as far as the political landscape is concerned, and you're not, and you have to backtrack? Or is there always a link between what you do and government objectives and visions?
Well, there isn't always a link, but we have a very good starting point, because we only finance areas where we get demand, direct demand from a government or from the private sector or from civil society. And the way we bolster across political fluctuations and instability across countries is through investing in these policy units and think tanks, because they survive political cycles and they're able to provide the capacity that is needed. And the last area which we do is invest in leadership development and invest in visioning and strategy work, because that then remains whether the government is in place or not. The people move on to the private sector, countries in conflict, people move to a neighboring country, and so the skills kind of shop around, move around, but they remain on the continent. Of our programs, less than 2% of the people we have developed have left the continent. So 98% have remained really on the continent, whether in the public or private sector. but it is not always smooth, and there are times you lose 5-10 years when governments change and you don't get that very smooth growth in capacity.
Yeah, I would imagine it's a very difficult task because we do know that Africa over the years has suffered from a skills deficit. Now, on the skills front, you say there are 27 think tanks that you have held established across the continent. Just how effective are these think tanks, particularly given the history that we know of African governments not wanting perhaps not so much as another center of power, but the development of independent thought in some of their countries?
I'll give 3 examples of how these think tanks have managed to deal with those constraints. One is EDRI in Ethiopia, which worked with a network of economists that we support there to create a commodity market. Those are things that were not available before, and through a research and analysis they launched a commodity market, and it had immediate impact on the economy. When you look at a different type of think tank in Ghana, the Institute for Democratic Governance, they were very, very important in the transformation from one political party to the next in this peaceful transition during the last election in Ghana. And then the third one is, let's say, KIPRA in Kenya, which has been very influential in visioning. They have created the first Kenya 2030 vision, which was the background for the economic recovery program that Kenya used when they went through their political troubles and came out of it. And they have been very helpful in working with both parties to put in place economic policies that lead Kenya towards higher growth levels.
And I suppose, I mean, much of the what you're talking about from this, from the good outcomes, is got to do with skill retention and the ability to keep skills in the country so that you're able to get a higher base of growth from those points. You say that you've been able to retain 98% of the skill in these countries, and you maybe have lost 2% maybe to other countries, and maybe European countries or other Western countries. Do you find that 98% of skill stay maybe in the public sector, or do they potentially migrate into the private sector and stay in the private sector?
The skills migrate. There's a really healthy revolving door in many countries between the private sector and public sector, and we think that's very healthy. But it does give a particular challenge to the public sector, because the public sector doesn't compensate as well. And so whenever there's a loss of skill, the private sector benefits, but the public sector needs to generate more skills. So that's why there's still a shortage of skills on the continent. The other gap we find is utilization. You have really talented people, but within the government structures, the best ideas don't always come through. So we've invested in creating platforms for policy dialogue, for knowledge sharing, for focusing on performance-based measurement and results frameworks for governments, so that they can actually use the skills that they already have. And then finally, we've done a lot of work to invest in civil society and the private sector to professionalize their voices. Because in many countries in Africa, the private sector doesn't have a big role in policy making. And through these efforts to professionalize them, to get them organized and be able to be a good partner to government, both in the thinking side, but also in the evaluating side of policy. And this we find in countries like Rwanda, where we supported the creation of a business association, and they have come out now as the best reforming country in Africa and in the world, following the global World Bank Doing Business indicators. So I think Rwanda is a particular example where this partnership between the public and private sector has given good results, with people moving back and forth between the sectors.